The son of one of England's wealthiest dukes lay motionless in his bed, his legs useless for 3 long years. The finest physicians in London had examined him, pronounced his condition permanent, and collected their exorbitant fees. But when an elderly cleaning woman knelt beside his bed one autumn morning and placed her weathered hands upon his legs, something extraordinary happened that would shake the very foundations of the Duke's prideful world. But before we continue, please check if you're subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The year was 1872, and the Hampshire estate of Duke Edward Ashworth stood as a monument to centuries of accumulated wealth and power. On a crisp October morning, 16-year-old Thomas Ashworth rode his prize stallion across the estate's sprawling grounds, racing against the autumn wind with the reckless confidence of youth and privilege. Thomas was the Duke's only son, heir to one of England's most influential titles. He had his father's strong jaw and his late mother's gentle eyes, though those eyes rarely showed gentleness. He had been raised to command, to expect obedience, to view the world as something that existed to serve the Ashworth name. The horse stumbled on uneven ground near the old stone wall that bordered the eastern pasture. Thomas, showing off for the stable hands who watched from a distance, had pushed the animal too hard. The stallion's front leg caught in a rabbit hole, and the beast went down with a terrible scream. Thomas flew forward, his body twisting unnaturally in the air before crashing against the ancient stones. The impact was sickening. The stable hands ran toward him, their faces white with terror, knowing that whatever had happened would change everything. When they reached him, Thomas was conscious but unable to move his legs. His face was contorted in confusion and pain as he stared down at his lower body, willing it to respond. Nothing happened. The stable master, a gruff man named Harrison who had served the estate for 40 years, immediately sent for the Duke and ordered the others to fetch a board to carry the young master back to the manor. Duke Edward Ashworth received the news in his study, where he had been reviewing accounts with his estate manager. The colour drained from his face as the breathless footman delivered the message. Without a word, the Duke rose and strode from the room, his expensive leather boots echoing through the marble halls. By the time he reached his son, Thomas had been carefully moved to a ground-floor guest room. The boy's face was pale, his hands gripping the bedsheets as he tried repeatedly to move his legs. The Duke stood in the doorway, watching his heir struggle, and for the first time in his life, felt utterly powerless. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore arrived from London within 36 hours, travelling through the night at the Duke's urgent summons. He was considered the finest neurological physician in England, a man who had studied in Edinburgh, Vienna, and Paris. His fees were astronomical, his reputation impeccable. The examination took 3 hours. Dr. Whitmore tested Thomas's reflexes, sensitivity, and muscle responses with various instruments. He asked questions about sensation, pain, and movement. Thomas answered everything with growing frustration, his voice becoming sharper with each question that confirmed what he already knew. He could not feel or move anything below his waist. Duke Ashworth paced the hallway outside, refusing food or rest. His face was set in hard lines, his hands clasped behind his back. Estate servants whispered nervously as they passed, knowing better than to approach their master in such a state. When Dr. Whitmore emerged, his expression was grave. The Duke led him immediately to the study, closing the heavy oak door behind them. The physician accepted a glass of brandy but did not drink it. "Your Grace," he began carefully, "your son has suffered what we call a spinal concussion. The impact against the wall has damaged the delicate structures within his backbone. The paralysis appears to be complete from the waist down." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Can it be repaired? Surgically?" Dr. Whitmore shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid not. The spine is not like a broken bone that can be set. The damage to the nervous tissue is, in all likelihood, permanent. I've seen perhaps a dozen cases similar to this in my career. None have recovered meaningful function." "None?" The Duke's voice was dangerously quiet. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. I've consulted with colleagues across Europe on such cases. The consensus is clear. Your son will require assistance with all aspects of daily living. He will never walk again." The silence that followed was suffocating. The Duke stood at the window, staring out at the manicured grounds where his son would never ride again. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "Get out, Doctor." Whitmore set down his untouched brandy and quietly withdrew, leaving the Duke alone with the unbearable truth. The following weeks transformed Ashworth Manor into a strange, hushed place. The Duke hired 2 male nurses from London to attend to Thomas around the clock. They managed the difficult, humiliating tasks that the paralysis required: bathing, dressing, managing bodily functions. Thomas endured it all with a grim silence that worried everyone more than anger would have. The Duke spared no expense. He commissioned a wheeled chair from a renowned craftsman in Birmingham, upholstered in leather and equipped with large wheels that could navigate both indoor corridors and outdoor paths. He had ramps built at every entrance to the manor. He converted the entire east wing of the ground floor into Thomas's new domain, installing gas lighting and ordering furniture that could be easily moved. But money could not restore what had been lost. Thomas spent his days staring out windows at the world he could no longer freely inhabit. The young man who had once galloped fearlessly across the estate now could not even stand without assistance. The heir who was meant to command armies and manage vast holdings could not perform the most basic functions without help. The Duke visited his son daily, but the conversations were stilted and brief. Edward Ashworth was a man accustomed to solving problems through wealth and influence. This problem defied both. He would enter Thomas's room with forced cheerfulness, discuss estate matters or local news, then retreat when his son's hollow responses made clear that nothing had changed. "I've written to specialists in Germany," the Duke announced one afternoon. "Professor Helmholtz in Berlin has agreed to review your case." Thomas didn't turn from the window. "What's the point, Father?" "The point is that we don't accept defeat. The Ashworth family never has. The Ashworth family also never had a crippled heir before." The word came out bitter, self-loathing. The Duke flinched. "Don't use that word." "Why not? It's what I am." Thomas finally looked at his father, and the pain in his eyes was worse than any physical injury. "I'm useless to you now, useless to the family, to the title, to everything." "That's not true, isn't it?" Thomas's laugh was harsh. "What duke commands from a wheeled chair? What nobleman cannot even stand to greet his peers? I've become an embarrassment, Father, an expensive, permanent embarrassment." The Duke had no answer. He left the room without another word, his footsteps heavy on the marble floor. As autumn turned to winter, Thomas's physical condition stabilized, but his mental state deteriorated. The nurses reported that he barely ate, refused to participate in the exercises they suggested, and spent most nights awake, staring at the ceiling. The Duke brought in more specialists. A physician from Edinburgh examined Thomas and prescribed tonics that did nothing. A nerve specialist from Paris conducted painful electrical treatments that produced no results except to leave Thomas exhausted and demoralized. A controversial practitioner from Vienna attempted hypnosis, claiming he could awaken dormant nerves through the power of suggestion. Thomas submitted to it all with grim resignation, and nothing changed. The estate staff walked on eggshells. The Duke's temper, never mild, became volcanic. He dismissed servants for minor infractions and shouted at his estate manager over trivial matters. Everyone understood that his rage was really directed at the universe that had crippled his son, but understanding didn't make it easier to endure. Christmas of 1872 was a somber affair. Tradition dictated that the Duke host the local gentry for a grand celebration, but this year he cancelled everything. The manor remained dark except for Thomas's rooms. No decorations adorned the halls, no carols were sung. On Christmas morning, the Duke brought his son an expensive gift, a collection of rare books on military history, Thomas's former passion. The young man barely glanced at them. "Thank you, Father," he said mechanically. The Duke sat heavily in the chair beside the bed. He suddenly looked old, his face lined with exhaustion. "I don't know what else to do, Thomas." For a moment, something like sympathy crossed Thomas's face. "I know. Tell me what you need. Anything. I'll provide it." Thomas turned back to the window, where snow was beginning to fall over the frozen grounds. "I need my legs back. Can you provide that?" The Duke had no answer. He left his son alone with his expensive, useless gifts. Mrs. Eleanor Price arrived at Ashworth Manor on a cold January morning in 1873. She was 63 years old, a widow from a village 10 miles distant. Her late husband had been a groundskeeper on a neighboring estate, and she had worked alongside him for 40 years before his death the previous spring. The manor's housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, had hired Mrs. Price without consulting the Duke. The winter was harsh, Several housemaids had left to marry and the work needed doing. Mrs. Price came with excellent references and asked for modest wages. She was hired to clean the servants' quarters, the kitchens and some of the lesser-used rooms. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her hands were rough and reddened from decades of labor. Her face was deeply lined, but her brown eyes were sharp and kind. She wore the same black dress every day, carefully mended, with a white apron that she kept spotless, despite the nature of her work. Mrs. Price went about her duties quietly and efficiently. She arrived before dawn and worked until dusk, never complaining about the long hours or the cold that seeped through the manor's stone walls. The other servants found her pleasant but private. She ate her meals alone, spoke little, and asked for nothing beyond what she needed to do her work. She had been at the manor for 3 weeks before she first saw Thomas. She was cleaning the hallway near his rooms early one morning when one of the nurses emerged looking frustrated. "The young master refuses breakfast again," the nurse muttered to his colleague. "3rd day running. He'll make himself ill." Mrs. Price paused in her scrubbing but said nothing. It wasn't her place to comment on the master's son. She had learned long ago that servants who involved themselves in family matters rarely kept their positions long. But that afternoon, as she cleaned the morning room adjacent to Thomas's quarters, she heard sounds that made her stop. Harsh, broken sobbing, the kind of crying that came from deep despair, the kind that couldn't be helped or hidden. She stood still, her cleaning cloth forgotten in her hands. The sound cut through her heart. She had raised 3 children of her own, all grown now, scattered to various positions and marriages. She recognized the sound of a young person in agony. Mrs. Price looked toward the closed door of Thomas's rooms, then down at her cleaning supplies. It wasn't her place, she was just the cleaning woman. She turned back to her work, but the sound of that desperate crying stayed with her all day. Mrs. Price was assigned to clean the East Wing corridors twice weekly. This brought her regularly near Thomas's rooms, though she was strictly forbidden from entering them. The Duke's son's private quarters were tended only by his personal nurses and his valet. A mere cleaning woman would never be permitted such access, but from the hallway, Mrs. Price observed things that others missed. She noticed that the nurses often stepped out together, leaving their charge alone. She heard them complain about Thomas's difficult behavior, his refusal to cooperate, his depression. She saw them roll their eyes when they thought no one was watching. One morning, she witnessed one of the nurses being particularly rough while helping Thomas into his chair, yanking his arm impatiently when the young man moved too slowly. Thomas's face went white with the effort of not crying out. The nurse muttered something under his breath about ungrateful nobility before wheeling Thomas to the window and leaving him there. Mrs. Price said nothing. It wasn't her place, but she felt her jaw tighten with anger. She also observed the Duke's visits. She would time her cleaning to be in the adjacent rooms when she knew he typically came. She heard the stilted conversations through the walls, the long silences, the forced cheerfulness that fooled no one. She heard the Duke's heavy footsteps as he left, faster each time, as if he couldn't wait to escape his son's presence. "The poor boy," Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper, said one day over tea in the servants' hall. "Not yet 17, and his life is over. It breaks my heart." "Tyson, the Duke can't accept it," added Mr. Harrison, the stable-master. "Brings in doctor after doctor, each more expensive than the last, and none of 'em can do a thing. Sometimes money can't fix what's broken." Mrs. Price listened but didn't contribute to the conversation. She had her own thoughts about what was broken in this house, and it wasn't only the young master's spine. That night, lying in her small room in the servants' quarters, Mrs. Price thought about her own life. She had worked since she was 8 years old. She had buried 2 infant children and nursed her husband through his final illness. She had known poverty, exhaustion, and grief, but she had also known simple joys: a warm fire on a cold night, fresh bread, her surviving children's laughter, her husband's hand in hers. What did that boy upstairs have? Wealth beyond measure, but no joy. Every comfort, except the one that mattered: hope. She fell asleep praying for him, though she barely knew him. February brought no improvement in Thomas's condition or spirits. The Duke's frustration grew into something darker, a simmering rage that infected the entire household. He snapped at servants, dismissed his estate manager for a minor accounting error, and spent hours locked in his study drinking brandy. The nurses grew increasingly careless. They had been hired at premium wages to care for a nobleman's son, but the work was tedious and the patient uncooperative. They began taking longer breaks, leaving Thomas alone for hours at a time. They complained openly in the servants' hall about his mood, his ingratitude, his stubbornness. "The boy's a spoiled brat," one of them said. "Won't even try the exercises. Just sits there feeling sorry for himself." Mrs. Price, sitting in the corner mending linens, pressed her lips together but said nothing. On a particularly cold morning, everything came to a head. Mrs. Price was cleaning the hallway when she heard a crash from Thomas's room, followed by shouting. She froze, her heart pounding. "I don't care." Thomas's voice, usually so flat and lifeless, was suddenly sharp with rage. Get out, and leave me alone." "Now see here, young master," one of the nurses began. "I said get out." Something else crashed, perhaps a water pitcher. "I don't want your help, I don't want anything, just leave me alone." The door burst open and both nurses emerged, one with water dripping down his vest. Their faces were red with anger and embarrassment. "That's it," one muttered to the other. "I'm done. Let him rot in there for all I care." They stormed past Mrs. Price without seeing her. She stood motionless in the corridor, her cleaning cloth in her hands, listening to the silence from Thomas's room. Then she heard it again, that terrible broken sobbing. She looked up and down the empty hallway. The nurses had disappeared down the stairs, probably to complain to the housekeeper. No one else was about. She set down her cleaning supplies and, before she could talk herself out of it, knocked gently on Thomas's door. The crying stopped abruptly. "Go away." Mrs. Price opened the door slowly. Thomas sat in his wheeled chair near the overturned breakfast table. Water pooled on the floor. His face was blotchy from crying, his hair disheveled. When he saw her, confusion crossed his features. "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Price, sir. I clean the corridors." She spoke calmly, as she might to a frightened child. "I heard the commotion. I thought you might need assistance." "I don't need anything." His voice was thick with tears. "Please leave." But Mrs. Price didn't leave. She looked at the mess, at the young man's tear-stained face, at the despair in every line of his body. And she made a decision. Mrs. Price walked to the overturned table and began quietly picking up the broken dishes. Thomas watched her with confusion and something like suspicion. "I told you to leave." "I heard you, sir." She continued her work, her movements calm and unhurried. "But someone needs to clean this up and those nurses won't be back for a while." "How do you know?" "Because I've observed that they take extended breaks when they're annoyed with you." She straightened, holding pieces of a shattered teacup, which seems to be rather frequently. Thomas blinked, startled by her directness. Servants didn't usually speak so frankly to their betters. "You've been observing. It's hard not to notice things when you work in the corridors, sir." She found a cloth and began mopping up the spilled water. "Walls are thinner than people think." He watched her work, this small old woman in her patched black dress, moving with practiced efficiency. There was something soothing about her presence, something that reminded him vaguely of his nurse from childhood, before she had been dismissed when he was 8. "I'm sorry about the mess," he said finally, his voice smaller. I couldn't stand it anymore. Their fake sympathy, their impatience, the way they look at me like I'm already dead." Mrs. Price paused in her cleaning. "You're not dead, sir. Might as well be." The bitterness was back. "What life is this? I can't walk, can't ride, can't do anything a man should do. I'm a burden to everyone." "Is that what you think?" She sat down uninvited in the chair beside his wheeled chair, looking at him directly. "That you're a burden? I know I am. I see it in my father's face every day. Disappointment, shame. He can barely stand to look at me." Mrs. Price considered this. "Or perhaps he can barely stand to see you suffering and know he can't fix it." "That's not the same thing, sir." Thomas shook his head. "You don't understand. I was supposed to be his heir. I was supposed to manage the estate, continue the family line. Now I'm just this." He gestured bitterly at his useless legs. "A cripple who can't even feed himself without help." "You're still his son," Mrs. Price said quietly. "And you're still alive. That counts for something." "Does it? To what end? So I can sit in this chair for another 50 years watching the world go on without me?" They sat in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Price spoke, her voice thoughtful. "My husband lost his arm in an accident with a plough when he was 40. thought his life was over, thought he was useless. But he learned to do his work with one arm. Took time, took patience, but he did it. Worked another 20 years before his heart gave out. Thomas looked at her skeptically. That's different. Is it? An arm isn't the same as legs, and a groundskeeper isn't the same as a duke's heir. No, she agreed, but suffering is suffering no matter whose body it's in, and giving up is giving up, whether you're a groundskeeper or a nobleman. Thomas didn't know how to respond to Mrs. Price's words. No one had spoken to him like this before, not with pity, not with false optimism, but with simple, matter-of-fact truth. It unsettled him. The nurses will be angry that you're in here, he said finally. Let them be angry. She stood and finished cleaning the last of the spill. I'm only doing my job, cleaning up messes. If they didn't want me in here, they shouldn't have left such a mess to clean. Despite himself, Thomas felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Mrs. Price gathered up the broken dishes. Will you be all right until they return, sir? He nodded, suddenly not wanting her to leave, but not knowing how to ask her to stay. She seemed to sense this. I clean this corridor every Monday and Thursday morning, she said. If you should need anything cleaned on those days, you need only leave your door ajar, I'll check. It was a careful offer, not overstepping but leaving the door open. Thomas understood what she was really saying. If he needed someone to talk to, someone who wouldn't treat him like a broken thing, she would be there. Thank you, Mrs. Price. No thanks needed, sir. I'm just doing my work. She left, closing the door quietly behind her. Thomas sat in his chair staring at the closed door, feeling something he hadn't felt in months, a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. When the nurses returned an hour later, sheepish and clearly expecting him to still be in a fury, they found him calm. The room was clean, the mess gone. They exchanged confused glances, but said nothing, perhaps afraid of triggering another outburst. Thomas allowed them to help him back to bed without protest. As they went about their duties, he found himself thinking about the small old woman with the sharp eyes and direct manner. She had looked at him and seen not a cripple or a burden, but simply a person in pain. It was a small thing, but it mattered. That night, for the first time in months, Thomas slept peacefully. Monday morning came, and Thomas found himself watching the clock. Around 9, he heard the familiar sound of Mrs. Price's footsteps in the corridor. The nurses were downstairs taking their breakfast. Without fully understanding why, Thomas opened his door slightly. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Price appeared with her cleaning supplies. She glanced at the open door, then knocked lightly. "Come in," Thomas called. She entered, taking in the room with a quick, assessing glance. "Morning, sir. Anything need attending to?" "Actually, yes. There's a book that fell behind the table yesterday. I can't reach it from my chair." It was a lie. The book was perfectly accessible, but Mrs. Price retrieved it without comment, handing it to him. "Thank you." He hesitated. Would you mind staying for a moment? The nurses are at breakfast and I—" He trailed off, embarrassed. "You'd like some company that doesn't treat you like an invalid," she finished for him. "I can spare a few minutes, sir." She sat in the chair she'd used before, folding her rough hands in her lap. "Have you been reading much?" "Trying to. My father brings me books, but I can't seem to focus." He set the book aside. "Mrs. Price, may I ask you something?" "Of course, sir. How did your husband manage? After losing his arm, I mean, how did he keep going?" Mrs. Price thought carefully before answering. "Well, sir, first he mourned. He raged and cried and cursed God and the world. Took him near a month. Then one day, he got up and said, 'Well, the arm's not growing back, so I best figure out what I can do with what's left.' And he did. Just like that? Not just like that, no. Took years to truly accept it. But he made the choice to try. That was the important part. The choice." Thomas absorbed this. "The doctors say I'll never walk again. That's not like learning to work with one arm. This is permanent." "Aye, it likely is." She didn't soften it or offer false hope. "But permanent doesn't mean finished. You're still here, sir. You've still got your mind, your voice, your hands. You can still read, think, learn, even lead if you choose to." "Lead from a wheeled chair? How?" "I don't know the details of nobility, sir. But I imagine a duke needs a good mind more than good legs. Your father runs this estate from a desk, not a saddle." It was true. Thomas had never thought of it that way. His father spent most of his time in his study, managing accounts, writing correspondence, making decisions. The actual physical work was done by others. but the title requires appearances, ceremonies, standing before peers. Then you'll sit before them with more dignity than they stand. Let them think what they will. You know your worth, sir, that's what matters." The Duke noticed the change in his son before he understood its source. Thomas began eating his meals again. He asked for newspapers and actually read them. He stopped refusing the nurse's help, though he remained distant with them. Edward Ashworth was cautiously hopeful. Perhaps Thomas was finally accepting his condition. Perhaps the worst of the depression was passing. He visited more frequently, and though their conversations were still awkward, they were no longer quite so painful. "You seem better, my boy," the Duke ventured one afternoon in late February. Thomas looked up from the book he was reading. "I suppose I am. A bit. Has something changed? A new treatment the nurses are trying?" "No, nothing like that." Thomas hesitated. How could he explain that a cleaning woman's simple observations had done more for him than all the expensive doctors combined? "I've just been, thinking differently about things." The Duke nodded, satisfied with this vague answer. "Good. That's good. I've been thinking as well. Perhaps it's time we discussed your future more concretely. You're still my heir, Thomas. Paralysis doesn't change that. We need to consider how to prepare you for the responsibilities you'll one day assume." It was the first time the Duke had acknowledged that Thomas would indeed inherit, that there was a future worth preparing for. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest. "I'd like that, Father." The Duke stayed for an hour, discussing estate matters, explaining various aspects of management that Thomas had never paid attention to before. The young man listened attentively, asking intelligent questions. For the first time since the accident, Edward saw glimmers of the son he'd raised, the bright, capable boy who had been lost in despair these past months. As he left Thomas's room, the Duke felt lighter than he had in months. He was so absorbed in this hopeful mood that he almost didn't notice Mrs. Price in the corridor, quietly polishing the brass fixtures. He paused. "You're the new cleaning woman, aren't you?" Mrs. Price curtsied, keeping her eyes down respectfully. "Yes, Your Grace. Mrs. Eleanor Price. You do good work. The corridors are much improved." It was rare for the Duke to notice, let alone compliment, the lower servants. "Carry on." "Thank you, Your Grace." He continued on, not giving her another thought. He had no idea that this small, unassuming woman was the reason for his son's improvement, and Mrs. Price saw no reason to enlighten him. She simply returned to her polishing, a small smile on her weathered face. Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Every Monday and Thursday morning, when the nurses took their extended breakfast, Mrs. Price would spend 20 minutes or so with Thomas. They talked about everything and nothing: books, the weather, the estate, her memories of raising her children, his memories of life before the accident. She never pitied him, never treated him as fragile or broken. When he was being unreasonable, she told him so. When he made progress, she acknowledged it matter-of-factly. She was the first person since the accident to treat him as a normal young man, rather than a tragic figure. "I've been thinking about what you said," Thomas told her one morning, "about my father running the estate from his desk." "Have you now?" "Yes. I've asked him to teach me the account books, how to manage the tenants, the investments, all of it." He seemed pleased. I imagine he was. A father wants to see his son take interest in such things. Thomas fidgeted with the blanket across his lap. "Mrs. Price, may I ask you something personal?" "You may ask, sir. I'll decide whether to answer." "Why do you bother with me? You're a cleaning woman. I'm the Duke's son. We shouldn't even be speaking like this. You could lose your position if anyone knew." Mrs. Price set down her dusting cloth and looked at him directly. "I bother with you, sir, because I recognize suffering when I see it, and because I recognize a young person worth saving. You were drowning and I threw you a rope. That's what decent people do. But you barely know me. I know enough. I know you're not cruel, not like some nobility I've served. I know you're hurting and trying to find your way. That's enough for me." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "I don't know how to thank you." "Then don't. Just keep moving forward. That's thanks enough." But she was underestimating the bond forming between them. For Thomas, Mrs. Price was becoming something like the mother he'd lost years ago, the grandmother he'd never known. She represented stability, wisdom, and unconditional acceptance. He looked forward to her visits more than he would admit, even to himself. For Mrs. Price, Thomas had awakened something she thought was dormant, her maternal instincts. Her own children were grown and scattered. This hurting young man needed what she had to give: practical wisdom, gentle firmness, and genuine care. She told herself it was just Christian charity, but it was more than that. She was growing to care for the boy. Neither of them fully recognized how dangerous this attachment might become. The nurses, Roberts and Henshaw, were not stupid men. They noticed that Thomas's improvement seemed to coincide with Thursday and Monday mornings. They noticed the open door, the timing of their own breakfast routine, and eventually they noticed Mrs. Price's presence in the corridor at precisely the right times. "That cleaning woman is spending too much time near the young master's quarters," Roberts said to Henshaw over their evening meal in the servants' hall. "I've seen her coming out of his room twice now." "Probably cleaning up his messes," Henshaw replied, not particularly interested. "The boy's always knocking things over." "Perhaps, but it seems irregular. We're his nurses. No one else should be attending to him." "Then mention it to the housekeeper if you're concerned." But Roberts was reluctant to do that. If they complained, it might come out that they'd been leaving their patient unattended during their breakfast hour. Better to handle it quietly, watch the situation, and intervene if necessary. So they began observing. They noticed that Thomas's mood improved significantly after those Monday and Thursday morning conversations. They saw him smile occasionally, heard him laugh once or twice, something he hadn't done since the accident. They noticed books being moved, his increased appetite, his new interest in estate management. "Whatever she's doing, it's helping," Henshaw admitted grudgingly. "Boy's been easier to manage lately." "That's not the point. She's overstepping. She's a cleaning woman, not a nurse or a companion. It's not proper." "Proper be damned if it's working. Let her talk to him. Makes our job easier." Roberts wasn't satisfied, but he let it rest, for now. Meanwhile, Mrs. Price remained carefully discreet. She never stayed long, never drew attention to her visits. She made sure to be actively cleaning whenever anyone else was in the corridor. She was careful never to be seen in Thomas's room with the door closed. But discretion could only go so far. Servants gossiped, and Ashworth Manor was no exception. Whispers began to circulate. The new cleaning woman had taken a special interest in the young master. Some found it sweet, others improper. Mrs. Fletcher, the housekeeper, heard the rumors and frowned. "Mrs. Price," she said one day, catching the cleaning woman in the linen closet. "I've heard talk that you've been spending time with Master Thomas." Mrs. Price met her gaze calmly. "I've cleaned his room when the nurses were absent, and spills needed attending to, Mrs. Fletcher. Nothing more. See that it stays nothing more. Your position is to clean, not to socialize with your betters. The Duke wouldn't tolerate such presumption." "I understand, ma'am." But Mrs. Fletcher's warning came too late. The bond between Thomas and Mrs. Price had already formed, and bonds once made are difficult to break. March arrived with unusually fierce storms. Rain lashed the manor's windows, and cold wind howled through every crack and crevice. The servants worked double time to keep fires going, deal with leaks, and maintain some semblance of comfort. Thomas found the weather oppressive. The dampness made his paralyzed legs ache in strange, phantom ways. He felt trapped, staring out at the grey, rain-soaked grounds, unable to even wheel himself outside for fresh air. Mrs. Price found him in a dark mood one Thursday morning. "Storm's got you down, has it, sir?" "Everything's got me down today," he said bitterly. 3 months since the accident, and I'm no better. Still can't feel anything, still can't move. All the optimism in the world doesn't change that fact." She sat down, her old bones creaking slightly. "No, it doesn't. But optimism isn't about denying reality, sir. It's about choosing how you respond to it. Easy for you to say you can walk away whenever you please." Mrs. Price didn't take offense. "True enough. But I've had my own prison, sir, just of a different sort. 40 years of poverty, watching 2 babies die because we couldn't afford a proper doctor, nursing my husband through consumption for 6 months while still working dawn to dusk. We all have our crosses." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. No reason you should. I don't tell my history to make you feel guilty, sir. I tell it so you understand that suffering isn't unique to you. It's part of being human. The question isn't whether we suffer, but what we do with it." "And what did you do with yours?" "I kept living, kept working, found small joys where I could. A good meal, a kind word, the sun on my face. Raised my surviving children to be decent people. Made peace with what I couldn't change and changed what I could." Thomas stared out at the rain. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You're stronger than you think, sir. You've already survived the worst of it. The accident, the initial despair. You're still here. That takes strength. Or cowardice. Maybe I'm just too afraid to end it." Mrs. Price's voice sharpened. "Don't speak that way. That's the despair talking, not sense." "Is it? What future do I have, really? Even if I learned to manage the estate from this chair, what woman would marry a cripple? What kind of life is that, alone forever?" "You're 17 years old, sir. You don't know what the future holds. Women have married men in worse conditions for love. And besides, you're not alone now, are you? You've got me, odd as that friendship is." Despite himself, Thomas smiled slightly. "It is odd, isn't it? A duke's son and a cleaning woman. Very odd. Probably improper. But here we are." She stood, her joints protesting. "The storm will pass, sir. It always does. You just have to wait it out." After she left, Thomas sat thinking about her words. She was right. He wasn't alone. For the first time since the accident, he had someone who understood, who didn't judge, who simply accepted him as he was. It was enough to get him through another day. By late March, Thomas had made remarkable progress, not physically but mentally and emotionally. He was learning estate management from his father, reading voraciously, and even beginning to correspond with some of the Duke's business associates. He still couldn't walk, still needed help with basic functions, but he was no longer the despairing shell he'd been in January. The Duke noticed this transformation and, true to his nature, immediately began planning how to leverage it. If Thomas could manage an estate from a wheeled chair, then he could still serve the family name. The paralysis was unfortunate, but not insurmountable. They would simply have to manage appearances carefully. "I've been thinking," the Duke announced one afternoon, "that it's time to reintroduce you to society." Thomas looked up from the ledger he'd been studying, alarmed. "Father, I don't think—" "Nothing dramatic at first, just a few select visitors. Lord Pemberton and his family, perhaps, the Wainwrights, people who've known you since childhood. They've known me as someone who could walk, and they'll accept you as you are now, or they'll answer to me." The Duke's voice was firm. "You're still an Ashworth, Thomas. You're still my heir. It's time people remembered that." Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. The thought of facing people from his former life, of seeing pity or disgust in their eyes, was overwhelming. "I'm not ready." "Nonsense. You're doing excellently. You understand the estate accounts better than my manager now. You've read every book I've brought you. You're ready. That's different. That's private. This is necessary." The Duke's tone brooked no argument. "I've already sent invitations for a small gathering next month. Just tea, nothing elaborate. You'll attend." After his father left, Thomas sat frozen, his heart pounding. A social gathering. People staring at him, whispering about him, pitying him. He couldn't bear it. When Thursday came, he practically waited by the door for Mrs. Price. She arrived at her usual time and immediately sensed his agitation. "What's happened, sir?" He told her about the Duke's plan. "I can't do it, Mrs. Price. I can't sit there in front of everyone, being stared at like a curiosity." "Can you, or won't you? What's the difference? Can't means impossible. Won't means afraid. They're not the same thing." Thomas felt a flash of anger. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly, sir. You're afraid of being judged. That's natural. But hiding away in these rooms for the rest of your life isn't going to make you less afraid. It'll make you more so." "So you think I should do it? Subject myself to their pity and whispers?" Mrs. Price sat down, her expression thoughtful. "I think you have a choice, sir. You can let your paralysis define you, or you can define yourself despite it. Your father's giving you a chance to show people that you're still here, still capable, still the Duke's son. It won't be easy, but hiding never is either. What if they reject me? Then they're not worth knowing, but what if they don't? What if some of them surprise you?" Thomas wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He'd have to face society eventually. Better to do it on his father's terms, in his own home, than wait until the situation forced itself upon him in some worse way. "Will you be here that day?" he asked quietly. "I'm always here on Thursdays, sir." "But during the gathering, will you be nearby?" Mrs. Price understood what he was really asking. Would she be there as a source of support, even if hidden? "I'll make sure the corridors near the morning room are particularly well polished that day, sir." It was the best she could offer, and Thomas knew it. He nodded, taking what comfort he could from the promise. The following weeks were consumed with preparation for the gathering. The Duke hired additional servants, ordered new furnishings for the morning room, and had Thomas's wheeled chair refinished to look less medical and more dignified. He commissioned a new suit for his son, cut to fit someone who would remain seated. Thomas endured it all with growing anxiety. He practiced sitting upright for extended periods, practiced polite conversation with his father, practiced pretending that everything was normal when nothing would ever be normal again. The nurses noticed his increased tension and reported it to the Duke, who responded by hiring a barber to come weekly, a tailor to ensure every detail of Thomas's appearance was perfect. If his son couldn't stand, he would at least look impeccable sitting down. Mrs. Price watched these preparations with mixed feelings. She was proud of Thomas for agreeing to face society, but she worried about the Duke's motivations. Was he truly supporting his son, or was he trying to prove something to the world? That the Ashworth name could triumph over any adversity, even paralysis. "How are you holding up, sir?" she asked one Thursday morning, 2 weeks before the gathering. "I'm terrified," Thomas admitted. "I dream about it every night. People staring, whispering. Lady Catherine Pemberton used to fancy me, you know. Before. What will she think when she sees me now? She'll think what she thinks." "You can't control that, sir. You can only control how you present yourself. With dignity, I suppose. With honesty, sir. Don't pretend you're fine if you're not. Don't hide what you're feeling. Just be yourself. The young man who's survived something terrible and is learning to live with it, that's more impressive than any false bravado." Thomas absorbed this advice. It went against everything his father had taught him about maintaining appearances, but it felt true. "Mrs. Price, I need to ask you something important." "Go on, sir. If this goes badly, if I fail, if I humiliate my father and myself, will you still—" He struggled for words. "Will you still visit? Will you still talk to me?" She looked at him with such kindness that he felt his throat tighten. "Sir, I didn't come to you because you were impressive or successful. I came because you needed someone. That hasn't changed, and it won't change no matter what happens at your father's gathering. Promise?" "I promise." It was what he needed to hear. With Mrs. Price's support, he felt he could face almost anything. He didn't yet understand how severely that support would be tested. The day arrived with unseasonable warmth for early April. Sunlight streamed through the morning room's tall windows as servants arranged flowers, polished silver, and set out refreshments. The Duke moved through the preparations like a general before battle, correcting details, issuing orders, ensuring everything was perfect. Thomas was dressed and positioned in the morning room by noon, though guests weren't expected until 2. He sat in his refinished chair near the window, his new suit immaculate, his hair perfectly groomed. He looked every inch the young nobleman, except for the chair and the blanket discreetly covering his legs. "Remember," the Duke said, adjusting his son's collar for the 3rd time, "you're still an Ashworth. Hold your head up, show no weakness." "Yes, father. And if anyone asks about your recovery, tell them you're making progress. Never say never." "But the doctors said—" "I don't care what the doctors said. Hope is better than truth in this case." Thomas wanted to argue but didn't have the strength. He was too nervous, his stomach churning with dread. The guests began arriving at 2. Lord and Lady Pemberton came first, with their daughter Catherine, now 18 and even more beautiful than Thomas remembered. Behind them came the Wainwrights, the Hendersons, and several other local families of rank. The Duke greeted them all in the entrance hall, warning them subtly to treat Thomas normally, not to make a fuss about his condition. They all promised, their faces solemn with understanding and curiosity. When they entered the morning room, there was a collective pause. Thomas saw it happen, the moment when they registered his wheeled chair, his positioned legs, the reality of his paralysis. He saw shock, pity, and in a few faces, barely concealed revulsion. But he forced himself to smile, to greet each guest politely, to behave as though nothing was wrong. "Lady Pemberton, how lovely to see you. Miss Catherine, you're looking well. Lord Wainwright, thank you for coming." They responded with careful cheerfulness, taking seats around the room while servants poured tea and offered refreshments. The conversation was stilted at first, everyone avoiding the obvious topic, but gradually it found its rhythm. They discussed the weather, local gossip, estate matters. Thomas participated as best he could, but he felt like a performer in a play, Every word rehearsed, every gesture calculated. He was exhaustingly aware of being watched, evaluated, judged. Catherine Pemberton, to her credit, spoke to him directly and naturally. "I heard you've been studying estate management, Mr. Ashworth. That must be fascinating." "It is, actually. My father's been teaching me the account books. I never realized how complex the system was. Perhaps you could teach me sometime. Father never bothers explaining such things to me, says it's not suitable for ladies." There was a rebellious glint in her eye. "I'd be happy to, if your father approves." It was a surprisingly pleasant exchange, and it gave Thomas hope. Perhaps this wouldn't be so terrible after all. Then Lady Henderson, an older woman known for her tactlessness, spoke up. "Tell me, young man, do the physicians give you any hope of recovery? It must be dreadful being confined like this." The room went silent. Thomas felt every eye on him. Thomas struggled for words, his father's coaching warring with his own need for honesty. Before he could respond, the Duke intervened smoothly. "The physicians remain optimistic. We're exploring several promising treatments. Thomas makes progress daily." It was a complete lie, and Thomas felt it land on him like a physical weight. He looked at his father, saw the warning in his eyes, and something inside him snapped. "Actually, that's not true." The Duke's face went pale. "Thomas—" "No, father. I won't lie." Thomas turned to Lady Henderson, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "The physicians give me no hope of recovery, my lady. My spinal injury is permanent. I will never walk again." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. The Duke stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Thomas, you're overwrought. Perhaps you should rest." "I'm not overwrought. I'm tired of pretending." Thomas looked around at the gathered guests, all staring at him with various expressions of shock and pity. "Yes, I'm paralyzed. Yes, it's permanent. But I'm still here. I'm still learning to manage an estate. I'm still the Duke's heir. My legs don't work, but my mind does." "How brave," someone murmured, though Thomas couldn't tell if it was sincere or mocking. Catherine Pemberton spoke up, her voice clear. "I think it takes more courage to face reality than to hide behind false hope. I admire your honesty, Mr. Ashworth." But her mother quickly stood. "Yes, well, it's been lovely, but I think we should be going. Catherine, come along." Other guests followed suit, making hasty excuses, clearly uncomfortable with Thomas's outburst. Within 15 minutes, the room had cleared except for Thomas and his father. The Duke stood at the window, his back to his son, rigid with fury. The silence stretched unbearably. "I'm sorry, father," Thomas finally said, "but I couldn't—" "Couldn't what?" The Duke spun around, his voice sharp as a blade. "Couldn't maintain the dignity of this family for one afternoon. Couldn't show strength instead of weakness. Couldn't follow the simplest instructions. They weren't simple instructions. You wanted me to lie. I wanted you to give them hope, to show them that an Ashworth doesn't surrender to circumstance. Instead, you embarrassed yourself and shamed this family. I told the truth." "The truth?" The Duke laughed bitterly. "What good is truth when it destroys everything? Those people will go home and tell everyone that the Duke's son is a broken, pitiful creature. They'll whisper about it at every social gathering. They'll pity us. Better pity than—" "Nothing is better than pity." The Duke's voice rose to a shout. "I would rather they thought you dead than see you like this, groveling in your weakness." The words hung in the air, terrible and irrevocable. Thomas felt as though he'd been struck. His father's face immediately showed horror at what he'd said, but the damage was done. "I see," Thomas said quietly. "Then perhaps it would have been better if I had died in that accident. At least then you'd have your dignity intact." "Thomas, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. You've always meant it. I've seen it in your face every day since the accident. Disappointment, shame, the knowledge that your son isn't the heir you wanted." Thomas's voice was steady now, cold. "Well, I'm sorry I survived, father. Truly." He wheeled himself toward the door, but the Duke blocked his path. "Move aside, father. Not until we finish this conversation." "We're finished. You've made yourself clear." The Duke's face was anguished now, tears actually forming in his eyes. "Son, please, I spoke in anger. I didn't mean—" "Move." After a long moment, the Duke stepped aside. Thomas wheeled himself out, leaving his father standing alone in the now empty morning room. Surrounded by half-drunk tea and abandoned refreshments, the ruins of his ambition scattered around him. Thomas didn't stop at his room. He continued down the corridor, through the servants' areas, desperately seeking the one person who might understand. He found Mrs. Price in the linen closet, folding sheets. "Mrs. Price." His voice broke on her name. She turned, saw his face, and immediately closed the door behind them for privacy. "What happened, sir?" Everything poured out. The gathering, his honesty, his father's reaction, those terrible words. "I would rather they thought you dead." He sobbed as he spoke, all his carefully maintained composure crumbling. Mrs. Price listened without interruption, then knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "Your father spoke from wounded pride, sir. He didn't mean it." "He did. I saw it in his face. I'm an embarrassment to him." "No, sir. You're a mirror showing him his own helplessness, and he can't bear it. That's different from being an embarrassment. What difference does it make? He wishes I was dead. He wishes things were different. That's not the same as wishing you dead." She squeezed his hands. "You did right today, sir. You told the truth. That took courage. It ruined everything. It cleared the air. Better that than building a life on lies." She straightened, her old knees creaking. "Your father will come around. He just needs time. And if he doesn't, then you'll go on without his approval. You've been doing that already, haven't you? Learning to live with this, finding your way forward. You don't need his permission to exist, sir." Thomas wanted to believe her, but the pain was too fresh. His father's words echoed in his mind. "Rather you dead than see you like this. Mrs. Price, I don't think I can stay here." "Not after this." She looked alarmed. "Now don't talk foolishly, sir. Where would you go?" "I don't know, anywhere. The London house, perhaps. Somewhere father doesn't have to look at me and be reminded of his disappointment. Running away won't solve anything. Neither will staying." He looked at her desperately. "Come with me, please. I need someone, and you're the only person who understands." Mrs. Price stepped back, shaking her head. "Sir, I can't. I'm a servant. It wouldn't be proper, and besides, I've got my position here to think of. I'll pay you double, triple what you're earning now. You'd be my companion, not my servant. Please, Mrs. Price, I can't do this alone." She was torn. She cared for the boy deeply, but what he was suggesting was impossible. A young nobleman and an elderly cleaning woman traveling together. It would cause scandal, ruin both their reputations. And yet, seeing his desperation, seeing how much he needed her— "Let me think on it, sir. Don't make any rash decisions tonight. Wait until morning, until cooler heads prevail. Promise you'll consider it?" "I promise I'll consider it. Now you should go to your room, sir. Get some rest. Things will look clearer in the morning." But things would not look clearer in the morning. In fact, they were about to get much worse. While Thomas was speaking with Mrs. Price, the Duke was in his study, drinking brandy and replaying the disaster of the afternoon. His son's words echoed in his mind. "I'm sorry I survived." The look of betrayal in Thomas's eyes when he'd said those terrible things. Edward Ashworth was not a man given to self-reflection, but tonight he couldn't avoid it. He'd pushed his son towards something he wasn't ready for, insisted on appearances over honesty, and when Thomas had shown courage by telling the truth, he'd punished him for it. And those words, "Rather you dead." God, had he really said that? To his own son? He drained his glass and poured another, his hands shaking. He needed to fix this, but how? An apology seemed inadequate. Money wouldn't help. What his son needed was acceptance, understanding, the things that Edward had failed to provide these past months. There was a soft knock at the door. "Enter." It was Roberts, one of the nurses. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I thought you should know something." "What is it?" The Duke's voice was sharper than intended. Roberts hesitated, then plunged forward. "It's about Master Thomas and one of the servants, Your Grace. The cleaning woman, Mrs. Price. They've been spending time together. Quite a lot of time, actually. Private conversations, closed doors, the other servants are talking." The Duke went very still. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Your Grace. I'm simply reporting what I've observed. The woman's been in his room multiple times, alone with him. Today, after the gathering, I saw them together in the linen closet. He was crying, and she was comforting him. Every protective instinct the Duke possessed roared to life. His son, vulnerable and paralyzed, being taken advantage of by a servant. It was unthinkable. Where is my son now?" "In his room, Your Grace. But the woman, find her. Bring her to me immediately." Roberts bowed and hurried out. The Duke stood at his window, his mind racing. He'd been so focused on managing his son's physical care that he'd missed what was happening right under his nose. A servant insinuating herself into Thomas's life, taking advantage of his vulnerability and loneliness. It had to stop. Now. 10 minutes later, Mrs. Price was escorted into the study by Roberts. She stood calmly before the Duke's desk, her rough hands folded over her apron, her expression neutral. "Your Grace sent for me." The Duke studied her. She looked like what she was, a poor, aging cleaning woman, completely unremarkable. And yet, according to Roberts, she'd somehow formed an inappropriate attachment to his son. "Mrs. Price, I understand you've been spending time with my son. I've attended to cleaning tasks in and near his rooms, Your Grace, as is my duty. Don't play games with me. You've been having private conversations with him, closed-door meetings. Today you were alone with him in the linen closet." Mrs. Price's expression didn't change. "The young master was distressed, Your Grace. I offered what comfort I could. There was nothing improper about it." "Nothing improper. You're a servant. He's the Duke's son. The very idea of such familiar conversation is improper." "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but the young master needed someone to talk to, someone who didn't judge him or pity him. I provided that." "If that's improper, then I'm guilty." Her calm dignity infuriated him. "You've taken advantage of a vulnerable young man. You've overstepped your position terribly. I won't have it in my household." "I've taken advantage of no one, Your Grace. I've shown kindness to a suffering boy. If you see that as wrong, then perhaps the problem isn't with me." The Duke's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me that way? You asked me to explain myself, Your Grace. I'm doing so. You're dismissed. Leave my house immediately. I'll have your wages sent to you." Mrs. Price nodded slowly. "As you wish, Your Grace. May I say goodbye to Master Thomas?" "Absolutely not. You're to leave now. Roberts will escort you to collect your things. You're not to go near my son again." For the first time, Mrs. Price's composure cracked slightly. "Your Grace, please reconsider. The boy needs... My son needs protection from opportunistic servants. That's what he needs. Now get out." Mrs. Price stood her ground for one more moment, looking the Duke directly in the eye. "You're making a mistake, Your Grace. A terrible mistake. That boy finally had someone who understood him, who didn't make him feel broken, and you're taking that away because of your pride. Get out." Mrs. Price curtsied stiffly and left the study. Roberts escorted her to the servants' quarters, where she packed her meager belongings in silence. 15 minutes later, she walked out of Ashworth Manor into the cold April night, carrying everything she owned in one small bag. She didn't get to say goodbye to Thomas. She didn't get to explain. She simply disappeared from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it. Thomas woke the next morning feeling emotionally drained but slightly hopeful. He'd had time to think overnight. Perhaps his father would apologize. Perhaps they could start fresh, build a relationship based on honesty instead of false appearances. He rang for the nurses, who came in with breakfast and began their morning routine. As they worked, Thomas asked casually, "Is Mrs. Price working the East Corridor today?" The nurses exchanged glances. "Mrs. Price is no longer employed here, Master Thomas." He felt the world tilt. "What?" "She was dismissed last night. The Duke's orders." "Dismissed? Why? What happened?" Henshaw, the more talkative of the two, couldn't resist sharing. "Apparently she was getting too familiar with you, sir. The Duke didn't think it proper. Sent her packing immediately." Thomas's heart pounded. "Where did she go?" "Don't know, sir. Probably back to wherever she came from." After the nurses left, Thomas sat in stunned silence. His father had dismissed Mrs. Price. The one person who had helped him, who had understood him, who had made life bearable, gone. Because of propriety. Because the Duke couldn't stand the idea of his son finding comfort in someone beneath their station. The anger that rose in Thomas was unlike anything he'd felt before. It was cold, focused, and absolute. His father had taken everything from him, his mobility, his future, his dignity at yesterday's gathering, and now the one friendship that had mattered. He wheeled himself to his father's study and entered without knocking. The Duke looked up, his face showing traces of the previous night's drinking. "Thomas, we need to talk about—" "You dismissed her." "The servant woman?" "Yes. It was necessary." "Necessary?" Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "She was helping me. For the first time since the accident, I had someone who understood, who made me feel like I wasn't just a burden or a disappointment. And you threw her out. She was taking advantage of your vulnerability. She was the only one who wasn't. She didn't pity me or lie to me or try to parade me in front of society like some trained dog. She treated me like a human being." The Duke stood, defensive. She was a servant overstepping her bounds. The relationship was inappropriate. Inappropriate? Thomas laughed bitterly. "You know what's inappropriate, father? Telling your son you wish he was dead? That's inappropriate. Lying to guests about my condition? That's inappropriate. Dismissing the one person who actually helped me? That's not just inappropriate. That's cruel. I was protecting you. From what? Kindness? Understanding? Someone who actually cared about me as a person rather than as an heir? Thomas, you don't understand. I understand perfectly." Thomas turned his chair toward the door. "I understand that you can't bear having a crippled son, so you'll do anything to make it easier on yourself, even if it destroys me in the process." "That's not fair." Thomas stopped at the door and looked back at his father. "Nothing about this is fair, father. But I'm done pretending it is. I'm done trying to be the son you want. And I'm especially done listening to you." He wheeled himself out, leaving the Duke standing in his study, looking older and more lost than Thomas had ever seen him. Back in his room, Thomas made a decision. If Mrs. Price couldn't come to him, he would go to her. He didn't know where she lived, but he'd find out. The estate records would have her address from when she was hired, but there was a problem. He couldn't access those records without help, and he couldn't leave the manor without assistance. He was trapped by his own paralysis and his father's control. For the first time, Thomas truly understood how complete his imprisonment was. The realization brought a despair deeper than any he'd felt before. Thomas spent the next 3 days in dark silence. He refused to speak to his father, barely ate, and ignored the nurse's attempts at conversation. He was back where he'd been in January, but worse. Now he knew what he was missing. On the 4th day, Catherine Pemberton arrived unexpectedly. The Duke, desperate to salvage something from the disastrous tea party, had apparently continued his social rehabilitation plan. He had Catherine brought to Thomas's room. She entered carrying a book, her expression kind but uncertain. "Mr. Ashworth, I hope you don't mind my visit. Your father thought you might enjoy some company." Thomas wanted to refuse, to send her away, but something stopped him. Catherine had been kind at the gathering. She defended his honesty. Perhaps... "Please sit down, Miss Pemberton." She sat, arranging her skirts carefully. There was an awkward silence. "I brought you a book," she said finally. "Poetry, Wordsworth. I remember you enjoyed poetry when we were younger." "Thank you. That's thoughtful." He took the book but didn't open it. "Miss Pemberton, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you come? I mean truly. Was it your idea or your father's?" She blushed slightly. "A bit of both, I suppose. Father suggested it, but I wanted to come. I felt badly about how the tea ended, and I wanted you to know that some of us don't see you the way you think we do. How do I think you see me? As pitiable, broken. But I see someone who had the courage to tell the truth when it would have been easier to lie. That's admirable, not pitiable." Thomas studied her. She seemed genuine. An idea began forming in his mind. Dangerous, desperate, but possible. "Miss Pemberton, you seem like someone who values honesty." "I try to be. Then I need to be honest with you about something." He took a breath. "There was a woman who worked here, a cleaning woman named Mrs. Price. She was kind to me when no one else was. My father dismissed her because he thought her attention was improper. But I need to find her. I need to thank her properly and make sure she's all right." Catherine's eyes widened slightly. "I see. The problem is I can't leave the manor without help. I don't even know where she lives. I need someone to help me. Someone my father wouldn't suspect. Someone who could make inquiries without it being obvious." "You're asking me to help you find this woman?" "Yes, I know it's presumptuous. I know you barely know me. But you said you admired honesty, and I'm being as honest as I can be. I need help, and I don't know who else to ask." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, processing this unexpected request. "Mr. Ashworth, you understand that if I'm caught helping you in something your father opposes, it could cause significant trouble for both our families." "I know, and I wouldn't ask if it weren't important." She stood and walked to the window, her back to him. Thomas waited, his heart pounding. Finally, she turned. "My father's steward keeps records of local workers and their addresses. I could probably access them without suspicion. I sometimes help father with correspondence. If this woman was hired through an agency, there should be a record. You'll help me? Against my better judgment, yes, but only because I believe everyone deserves the chance to express gratitude. She met his eyes. And because you're right, there's something admirable about risking trouble for someone who showed you kindness. Thomas felt hope surge through him. Thank you, Miss Pemberton. Truly. Don't thank me yet. I may not be able to find her. And even if I do, I'm not sure how you'll manage to see her. One problem at a time. Catherine smiled slightly. Very well. I'll do what I can. Give me a week. After she left, Thomas felt more alive than he had in days. He had an ally, unlikely as she was. He had a plan, and he had hope that he might see Mrs. Price again. He didn't yet realize how complicated things were about to become. True to her word, Catherine returned a week later. She arrived mid-morning carrying more books as a pretense for her visit. The Duke, pleased by her continued attention to his son, readily granted her access. Once alone with Thomas, she pulled a folded paper from inside one of the books. I found her, Mrs. Eleanor Price, residing at a cottage near Millbrook Village. It's about 10 miles from here. Thomas took the paper with trembling hands. How did you manage it? The hiring agency had her address on file. I convinced them I needed to send her a reference letter from a family friend. Catherine sat down, her expression serious. Mr. Ashworth, now that you know where she is, what do you plan to do? I need to see her, to make sure she's all right and to thank her properly. But you can't travel alone. You'd need a carriage, servants, your father's permission. Then I'll go without permission. Catherine looked alarmed. You can't possibly... I can and I will. I just need help arranging it. He looked at her hopefully. Your help. Mr. Ashworth, this is beyond what I agreed to. If I help you leave the manor without your father's knowledge, it would be... I know what it would be, a scandal, improper. All the things society frowns upon, but sometimes propriety has to take a back seat to what's right. Get a help, which I'm not saying I do. How would this even work? You need assistance with everything, transferring to a carriage, managing the journey, getting into the cottage once you arrive. I'll manage. I've gotten stronger these past months. I can transfer myself with some effort. And once I'm there, Mrs. Price will help me. You're assuming she'll want to see you. She was dismissed, humiliated, thrown out without even being allowed to say goodbye. She might be angry. Thomas hadn't considered this. The thought that Mrs. Price might blame him for her dismissal was painful, but he had to try. Even so, I have to see her. I have to apologize and make sure she's provided for. Catherine studied him carefully. This woman means a great deal to you. She saved my life. Not medically. The doctors did that. But she saved me from drowning in despair. She gave me hope when I had none. Yes, she means a great deal to me. After a long silence, Catherine sighed. If I help you, and I'm still not saying I will, when would you want to do this? Thursday, it's the day she used to visit me. It seems fitting. That's 3 days from now. Your father would notice your absence immediately. Not if we time it correctly. The Duke goes to London every other Thursday for business meetings. He'll be gone from dawn until evening. The nurses take their long breakfast precisely at 9. If we left then, we'd have hours before anyone realized I was missing. Catherine shook her head in disbelief. You've planned this thoroughly. I've had nothing else to think about for days. She was quiet again, warring with herself. Finally, she spoke. I have a cousin, James, who's discreet and sympathetic to romantic causes. He might be persuaded to drive us if I present this correctly. Us? You'd come with me? Someone has to ensure you don't end up in a ditch somewhere. And it would be highly improper for you to visit a woman's cottage alone, paralyzed or not. At least with me present. There's some pretense of propriety. Thomas felt overwhelming gratitude. Miss Pemberton, I don't know how to thank you. You can thank me by not making me regret this decision. She stood to leave. Thursday, then. I'll arrange everything. But Mr. Ashworth, you need to understand. If this goes wrong, if you're injured or the scandal becomes public, both our families will suffer consequences. I understand, and I accept responsibility for whatever happens. After Catherine left, Thomas felt both exhilarated and terrified. He was actually going to do this, defy his father, risk scandal, make a dangerous journey in his condition, all to see a cleaning woman who'd shown him kindness. Some would call it foolish. His father certainly would. But to Thomas, it was the first truly independent decision he'd made since the accident. Paralyzed or not, He was still capable of choosing his own path. He spent the next 3 days preparing quietly. He practiced transferring himself from his chair to other surfaces, building his upper body strength. He chose clothing that would be easier to manage. He wrote a letter to his father, explaining his actions, to be delivered only if something went wrong. Thursday morning dawned clear and bright. The Duke left for London at 6 as scheduled. The nurses began their breakfast routine at 9 precisely, and at 9:15 Catherine arrived in a closed carriage with her cousin James at the reins. "Are you certain about this?" she asked one final time, as James and a footman helped Thomas into the carriage. Thomas settled into the seat, his useless legs positioned carefully. "I've never been more certain of anything." Catherine climbed in beside him, and James clicked his tongue to the horses. The carriage rolled forward away from Ashworth Manor toward Millbrook Village and whatever awaited them there. For the first time in 6 months, Thomas was leaving his prison. Paralyzed or not, he was free. The road to Millbrook was rougher than Thomas had anticipated. Every bump and rut sent jolts through his body, making him gasp with discomfort. His paralyzed legs might not feel pain, but the rest of his body certainly did, jarred and shaken by the carriage's movement. Catherine noticed his discomfort. "Should we stop? You look pale." "No. Keep going. I'm fine." "You're clearly not fine." "I said keep going." His voice was sharper than intended. "I'm sorry, Miss Pemberton, we've come this far. I won't turn back now." She didn't argue, but she looked worried. James, hearing the exchange through the small window behind him, slowed the horses slightly, choosing the smoother parts of the road when possible. They'd been traveling for nearly an hour when Catherine spoke again. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Ashworth? After all this, I think you've earned the right. This woman, Mrs. Price, is there anything improper between you?" Thomas was surprised by the question. "Improper? No, nothing like that. She's old enough to be my grandmother. She was kind to me, listened to me, treated me like a person rather than an invalid. That's all. Yet you're risking everything to see her. Because kindness matters, Miss Pemberton, especially when it comes from an unexpected source. She asked nothing in return for her help. She gained nothing from befriending me except the risk of dismissal, which is exactly what happened. I owe her more than I can ever repay." Catherine smiled slightly. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Ashworth. Most young men of your station wouldn't give a dismissed servant a second thought. Most young men of my station haven't had their lives destroyed by a riding accident. Suffering changes you. It shows you what really matters." They fell silent again as the carriage continued its bumpy progress. Thomas watched the countryside roll past. Fields he'd once ridden through, villages he'd passed without noticing. Everything looked different from the limited vantage point of a carriage window. After another half hour, James called down. "Approaching Millbrook, Miss Catherine. Where exactly are we headed?" Catherine consulted the paper with Mrs. Price's address. "Rose Cottage, on the north edge of the village. Ask at the tavern. Someone will know it." The village of Millbrook was small, perhaps 24 buildings clustered around a central green. James stopped at the tavern and made inquiries. A few minutes later, he returned. "Found it, miss. About a quarter-mile north, small cottage with a rose trellis. The tavern keeper says an elderly widow lives there alone." They continued on, and soon a small, weathered cottage came into view. It was humble, whitewashed walls that needed painting, a thatched roof with a few bare patches, a small garden in front, a stark contrast to Ashworth Manor. The carriage stopped in front, and Thomas felt his heart pounding. What if Mrs. Price refused to see him? What if she blamed him for her dismissal? What if his presence only made things worse for her? "Mr. Ashworth?" Catherine's voice was gentle. "We're here. Do you still want to do this?" Thomas looked at the cottage, at the closed door that separated him from the one person who truly understood him. "Yes, help me down, please." Getting Thomas from the carriage to his wheeled chair, which James had secured to the back of the carriage, was an awkward, undignified process. It required both James and Catherine helping, with Thomas doing his best to support his upper body weight. By the time he was seated in his chair, all three of them were breathing hard. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Catherine asked again, straightening her dress. "I'm sure. Will you come with me to the door?" "Of course." Catherine pushed Thomas's chair along the short path to the cottage door, while James waited with the carriage. The wheels struggled on the uneven ground, and twice they had to stop and navigate around ruts. Thomas felt simultaneously determined and ridiculous, a wealthy duke's son, being pushed in a wheeled chair to a humble cottage to see a dismissed servant. Catherine knocked on the door. They waited. Silence. She knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Price, are you there?" More silence. Thomas felt panic rising. What if she wasn't home? What if she'd moved away, unable to afford the cottage after losing her position? Then, finally, they heard footsteps. The door opened a crack, and Mrs. Price's weathered face appeared. Her eyes widened when she saw them. "Master Thomas, Miss—" She recognized Catherine from the manor. "What are you doing here?" "May we come in, Mrs. Price?" Thomas asked. "Please, I need to speak with you." Mrs. Price's face showed a mixture of emotions: surprise, concern, confusion. She glanced past them at the carriage, at James waiting patiently. "This isn't proper, sir. You shouldn't be here." "I know, but I came anyway. Please, just a few minutes." After a long hesitation, Mrs. Price opened the door wider. "Come in then, before the whole village sees you." The cottage was tiny, one main room serving as kitchen and sitting area, with a single bedroom visible through a doorway. The furniture was old but clean, the hearth swept, everything poor but cared for. Catherine had to maneuver Thomas's chair carefully through the narrow doorway. Mrs. Price closed the door and stood with her back to it, her arms crossed defensively. "Why have you come, sir? You've caused enough trouble for me already." The words stung, but Thomas understood her anger. "I came to apologize, and to make sure you're all right. I didn't know my father was going to dismiss you. If I had known, I would have tried to stop it. Would you? And what could you have done from your wheeled chair?" Her voice was bitter. "Your father made it clear I was taking advantage of you, overstepping my station. Perhaps he was right. He wasn't right. You helped me when no one else could. You gave me hope. And look where that got me, dismissed without a reference, barely able to afford this cottage on my savings. I'm too old to find decent work now, Master Thomas. Your father saw to that." Thomas felt guilt crushing him. He'd been so focused on his own needs, his own pain, that he hadn't fully considered the consequences Mrs. Price had suffered for helping him. "I want to help you. Financially, I mean. I have funds of my own, an allowance. Let me give you something to tide you over until—" "No." Mrs. Price's voice was firm. "I don't want your money, sir. That would make everything your father accused me of true, that I was befriending you for gain. But you need help. I'll manage, I always have." She looked at Catherine, who had been standing quietly near the door. "And you, miss, helping him come here. Do you know what scandal this could cause? A young lady, an eligible bachelor, traveling together unchaperoned to visit a common woman. Your reputation is my concern, not yours," Catherine said calmly. "Mr. Ashworth needed to see you. I chose to help him. I accept the consequences." Mrs. Price shook her head. "You're both fools. Well-meaning fools, but fools nonetheless." Thomas wheeled himself closer to her. "Mrs. Price, please, I understand you're angry. You have every right to be. But these past weeks without you have been unbearable. You were the only person who saw me as something other than a cripple or a disappointment. You gave me the strength to keep going. I couldn't just let you disappear without trying to thank you." Mrs. Price's stern expression softened slightly. "Oh, child, you don't need to thank me. I did what any decent person would do." "No, you did what most people wouldn't do. You reached out to someone suffering at risk to yourself. That's more than decent. That's noble." "I'm not noble, sir. I'm just an old woman who's seen enough suffering to recognize it in others." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Price's face crumpled slightly, and she sat down heavily in her only good chair. "I've missed you too, if you must know. Worried about you constantly. Wondered if you were managing, if your father had found someone else to help you, if you'd fallen back into despair. I nearly did, but I kept hearing your voice in my head, telling me to keep moving forward. It helped." Mrs. Price wiped at her eyes with her apron. "You shouldn't have come here, sir, but I'm glad you did." Mrs. Price stood and went to her small kitchen area, putting a kettle on the fire. "Well, since you're here, we might as well have tea. It's only proper." She glanced at Catherine. "Can you help me with the cups, miss?" Catherine joined her, leaving Thomas near the door. As the two women worked, Mrs. Price spoke quietly. "You care for him, don't you, miss?" Catherine was startled. I'm helping a friend in need, that's all." "That's not all, and you know it. I see how you look at him, how you risked your reputation to bring him here. Mrs. Price, I assure you, I'm not judging, child, just observing. He's a good young man despite everything. Or perhaps because of everything, suffering has made him better, not bitter. She poured hot water into a chipped teapot. But you should know that loving someone like him won't be easy. The world won't understand. His father especially won't understand. I haven't... Catherine struggled for words. We're just friends. For now, perhaps. Mrs. Price smiled slightly. But friendship has a way of growing into more when it's nurtured by shared hardship and honest conversation. They returned to the main room with tea. Mrs. Price served them in mismatched cups, apologizing for the poor quality. Thomas accepted gratefully, though managing the cup from his chair was awkward. "Mrs. Price," he said after a few sips, "I need to ask you something. That last day at the manor, you told me to wait until morning, that things would look clearer. Were you planning to come with me? If I'd asked you to leave with me?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, sir, I don't know. Part of me wanted to help you, to continue being there for you, but another part knew it was impossible. The difference in our stations, the scandal it would cause, the way people would talk, I think I would have convinced you to stay, to work things out with your father. And now, knowing how everything turned out, now I think perhaps you both needed this separation. You needed to learn that you could survive without me, that you're stronger than you think, and I needed to remember my place in the world." She set down her cup. "I'm not part of your life, Master Thomas. I never was, not really. I was a momentary comfort during a difficult time. But you have to build a life that doesn't depend on an elderly cleaning woman's wisdom. But I don't want to lose you completely." "You won't. What I taught you, the strength you found, that's yours now. You carry it with you. You don't need me there in person for it to be real." Thomas felt tears threatening. "It's not the same." "No, it's not, but it's what must be." She looked at Catherine. "You have other people who can help you now. People of your own station who understand your world better than I ever could." Catherine spoke up quietly. "With respect, Mrs. Price, you understand something important that most of us don't. How to see past the surface to the person underneath. That's not about station or education. That's about compassion." Mrs. Price smiled at her. "You're a wise young woman, miss. You'll do well by him, I think." Before Catherine could protest again, there was a knock at the door. All three of them froze. Mrs. Price stood and opened it cautiously. James stood there, his face worried. "Begging your pardon, but there's a rider coming fast from the direction of the manor. We should leave soon if we want to avoid trouble." Thomas felt his stomach drop. "My father?" "Can't be sure, sir, but it seems likely someone noticed your absence and sent word." Thomas looked at Mrs. Price. "I have to go, but please promise me you'll write if you need anything. Anything at all. Send letters to Miss Pemberton. She'll make sure I get them." Mrs. Price nodded. "I promise. Now go before you make things worse for all of us." Thomas wanted to say more, to find the words to express everything he felt, but there was no time. Catherine was already positioning his chair toward the door. "Thank you," he managed to say, "for everything." "You're welcome, child. Now go, and remember, keep moving forward. That's what matters." They got Thomas back into the carriage with desperate speed. As James urged the horses forward, Thomas looked back at the cottage. "Bates." Price stood in the doorway watching them go, one hand raised in farewell. He didn't know if he'd ever see her again, but she was right. What she'd given him, the strength and perspective and hope, he carried with him now. It was his, no matter what happened next. They saw the rider when they were still 2 miles from Ashworth Manor. It was Harrison, the stable master, on one of the Duke's fastest horses. He pulled up alongside the carriage, his face grim. "Master Thomas, your father's returned early from London. He's in a fury. You'd best prepare yourself." Thomas's brief sense of peace evaporated. "How much does he know?" "That you left without permission, with Miss Pemberton, in her cousin's carriage. That's enough, sir. He's threatening all manner of consequences." Catherine paled. "My father, does he know?" "A rider was sent to inform Lord Pemberton, miss. I'm sorry." The rest of the journey passed in tense silence. When they arrived at Ashworth Manor, the Duke was waiting in the courtyard, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Behind him stood Roberts and Henshaw, looking vindicated, and several other servants trying to remain invisible. James helped Thomas back into his wheeled chair with shaking hands. Catherine stood beside him, her chin raised defiantly despite her obvious fear. The Duke advanced on them. "What in God's name did you think you were doing?" "I went to visit Mrs. Price," Thomas said simply, "to apologize to her and make sure she was all right. You defied me. You snuck out like a common thief. You dragged Miss Pemberton into your foolishness, potentially ruining her reputation. You risked your health and safety all for what? A servant. For someone who showed me kindness when no one else did, including you. The Duke's face went purple. How dare you speak to me that way? After everything I've done for you, the doctors, the treatments, the care— The lies? Thomas interrupted. The forcing me to perform for society. The dismissing the one person who actually helped me. Yes, Father, you've done so much. Thomas, stop, Catherine whispered urgently. You're making it worse. But Thomas couldn't stop. Months of pent-up anger and frustration poured out. You want to know what I was doing? I was taking control of my own life for once. I was making my own decisions, seeing who I wanted to see. I was acting like a man instead of a child who needs permission for everything. You are acting like a child. A foolish, ungrateful child who doesn't understand the consequences of his actions. I understand perfectly. You're embarrassed. Your crippled son has caused a scandal. But you know what, Father? I don't care anymore. I'd rather be a scandalous cripple who makes his own choices than an obedient one who lives in a gilded cage. The silence that followed was absolute. Every servant in the courtyard held their breath, waiting for the explosion. Instead, the Duke's voice went deadly quiet. Get inside, we'll discuss this in private. No. Whatever you have to say to me, say it here. I'm tired of secrets and private shames. The Duke's control finally snapped. Fine. You want honesty. Here it is. You've humiliated this family. You've dragged Miss Pemberton's reputation through the mud. You've proven that you're not fit to be my heir because you can't think beyond your own selfish wants. Selfish? Thomas laughed bitterly. I went to check on someone you threw out of her job without cause. How is that selfish? Because everything you do reflects on this family. Your scandal becomes our scandal. Don't you understand that? Then disinherit me. The words exploded from Thomas, shocking everyone, including himself. If I'm such an embarrassment, such a burden, then disinherit me. Let someone else be your heir. Free us both. The Duke staggered as if struck. You don't mean that, don't I? You said yourself I'm not fit to be your heir. So make it official. Let me live my own life, away from your expectations and your shame. Catherine grabbed Thomas's arm. Mr. Ashworth, please, you're upset. I'm finally being honest. Thomas looked at his father, and for the first time, he felt no fear, no need for approval. I love you, Father, I always have. But I can't be what you want me to be. I can't be the perfect heir who rides and stands and performs for society. I can only be who I am, a paralyzed young man trying to find meaning in a life that went horribly wrong. If that's not good enough for you, then we need to part ways. The Duke's face showed something Thomas had never seen before. Genuine anguish, beyond anger or disappointment. Thomas, don't do this. You're the one doing it, Father. You've been doing it since the accident, pushing me away, hiding your disappointment behind expensive doctors and false hope. At least now we're being honest about it. I never wanted to push you away. I wanted to fix you. I can't be fixed. Don't you understand that yet? This is who I am now. Paralyzed, forever. The only question is whether you can accept that or not. The Duke opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and walked into the manor without another word. The servants scattered, not wanting to be caught in the aftermath. Thomas sat in his chair, suddenly exhausted. Catherine knelt beside him. That was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. I know, but it needed to be said. What happens now? I don't know. But whatever it is, I'll face it. I'm done hiding. The scandal spread through the county like wildfire. The Duke's son had disappeared with Lord Pemberton's daughter to visit a dismissed servant. The impropriety, the lack of judgment, the gossip was delicious and relentless. Lord Pemberton arrived at Ashworth Manor the next morning, furious. Thomas could hear the shouting from his room, two powerful men arguing about reputation, propriety, and what was to be done about their wayward children. Catherine was confined to her home, forbidden from seeing Thomas or anyone else until the scandal died down. She managed to send him one letter, smuggled by a sympathetic maid. Dear Mr. Ashworth, my father is threatening to send me to my aunt in Scotland until this blows over. I may not have made the wisest choice in helping you, but I don't regret it. You needed to see Mrs. Price, and I'm glad I could help make that happen. Whatever comes next, remember that you showed courage in taking control of your life. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Your friend, C. Pemberton P.S. Mrs. Price sent word through my father's steward. She's well and wants you to know she's proud of you. Thomas read the letter multiple times, treasuring both Catherine's support and Mrs. Price's message. He'd caused both women significant trouble, yet neither blamed him. It was humbling. His father didn't speak to him for 3 days. The Duke spent that time in his study or away from the manor entirely, avoiding his son. The nurses were instructed to provide only necessary care and no conversation. Thomas was effectively imprisoned in his own rooms. On the 4th day, the Duke finally came to see him. He looked older, worn, as if he'd aged years in days. "We need to discuss your future," he said without preamble. "I meant what I said about disinheritance," Thomas replied quietly. "If that's what you want." "It's not what I want. It's never been what I want." The Duke sat down heavily. "But I don't know how to bridge this gap between us, Thomas. I don't know how to be the father you need." It was the most honest thing his father had ever said to him. Thomas felt his anger softening slightly. "I don't need you to fix me, Father. I just need you to accept me. I'm trying, God knows I'm trying, but when I look at you I see—" He trailed off. "You see failure. Your failure, not mine." The Duke flinched. "Perhaps. I've always solved problems with money and influence, but this problem can't be solved that way, and it makes me feel powerless. Useless." "You're not useless. You're just trying to use the wrong tools." Thomas wheeled himself closer. "Father, I don't need expensive doctors or social appearances. I need you to listen to me, to respect my choices even when you don't understand them, to accept that my life will be different from what you planned, but it can still have meaning and purpose. Like visiting dismissed servants?" There was no malice in the question, just genuine confusion. "Like showing gratitude to people who help me, regardless of their station. Like making my own decisions about who I spend time with and how I live my life." "Yes, Father. Exactly like that." The Duke was quiet for a long time. "The scandal has damaged both our families. Lord Pemberton is furious with Catherine. Your reputation—" "My reputation was already damaged. I'm the crippled heir. This just gave people something new to talk about." "Don't say that word." "Why not? It's what I am. Hiding from it doesn't change it." Thomas met his father's eyes. "Father, here's what I propose. Let me learn to truly manage the estate. Not just study the account books, but actually make decisions. Give me real responsibility. Let me prove that I can be your heir, paralysis and all, without pretending I'm something I'm not. And if you fail, then I fail. But at least I'll have tried on my own terms." The Duke stood and walked to the window, his back to his son. "Your mother would have known what to do. She always understood things I couldn't see." It was rare for the Duke to mention Thomas's mother, who had died when he was 10. What would she have said? She would have said I was being an arrogant fool, that I was pushing away the most important thing in my life because of pride. He turned back to Thomas, and there were tears in his eyes. She would have been right. Thomas felt his own eyes burning. "Father, I'm sorry, Thomas, for everything, for not accepting you as you are, for dismissing Mrs. Price, who clearly helped you more than any doctor, for trying to make you fit into a mold that doesn't exist anymore." The Duke's voice broke. "I'm sorry for saying I wished you were dead. I would take that back 1,000 times if I could." "I know, Father. I forgive you." The Duke crossed the room and, for the first time since the accident, embraced his son. Thomas wrapped his arms around his father and let himself cry, releasing months of pain and anger and fear. When they finally pulled apart, both men were wiping their eyes. "So," the Duke said, trying to regain composure, "you'll manage the estate?" "I'd like to try." "And you'll stop sneaking off to visit servants?" Thomas smiled slightly. "I'll ask permission first." "I suppose that's progress." The Duke actually smiled back. "Though I'm making no promises about what I'll permit." "Fair enough." They talked for another hour. Really talked, for the first time in months. They didn't solve everything. There were still tensions, still adjustments to be made, but it was a beginning. Spring turned to summer at Ashworth Manor, bringing with it slow but significant changes. Thomas began actively managing portions of the estate under his father's supervision, proving himself capable despite his physical limitations. He met with tenants, reviewed contracts, and made decisions that his father increasingly trusted. The scandal gradually faded as new gossip replaced it. Catherine returned from her aunt's in Scotland in late June, still restricted from seeing Thomas unsupervised, but they began a careful correspondence. Her letters were intelligent and thoughtful, discussing literature, philosophy, and occasionally offering suggestions about estate management. Mrs. Price remained in her cottage near Millbrook. True to her word, she wrote occasionally, brief letters that mentioned her health and simple daily activities. She never asked for help, but Thomas arranged for anonymous assistance through various channels: repairs to her roof, firewood deliveries, occasional groceries left on her doorstep. He couldn't be certain she knew the help came from him, but he suspected she did. One afternoon in late July, Thomas was in the estate office reviewing tenant accounts when his father entered with an unexpected proposal. "I've been thinking about your education." Thomas looked up warily. "What about it?" "You've proven you can manage the practical aspects of the estate, but there's more to being a duke than accounting and tenant relations. You'll need to understand law, politics, economics at a higher level than my basic instruction can provide." "Are you suggesting university?" "Father, I can't exactly attend Oxford in a wheeled chair." "No, but I can bring Oxford to you. I've contacted several professors willing to come here for private tutorials, if you're interested." Thomas was surprised. "You'd arrange that for me?" "Why wouldn't I? You're still my heir. You still need proper education. Your legs don't change that." The Duke said it matter-of-factly, as if it were obvious. Perhaps it was becoming obvious, finally. "Then yes, I'm interested, very much so." The tutorials began in August. A philosophy professor from Cambridge came twice weekly. A legal scholar from London visited monthly. An economist corresponded with Thomas regularly, sending reading materials and detailed letters. Thomas discovered he had an appetite for learning that had been dormant during his school years. Without the distraction of physical activities, his mind engaged fully with academic challenges. He also began writing essays at first, analyzing economic theories and legal principles. Then, hesitantly, more personal pieces about his experience with paralysis, about what he'd learned from suffering. He showed these to no one, but the act of writing helped him process everything that had happened. In September, the Duke surprised him again. "Lord Pemberton has invited us to dinner, both of us. He's apparently satisfied that enough time has passed and the scandal has sufficiently died down." Thomas's heart jumped. "Will Miss Pemberton be there?" "I assume so. It's a family dinner." The Duke studied his son. "You care for her?" Yes, Father, I do. She helped you when she didn't have to, risked her reputation for you. Those aren't insignificant things." "I know, but what future can I offer her? Don't finish that sentence. You're the heir to a dukedom, receiving an excellent education, proving yourself capable of managing a large estate. Your legs are irrelevant to those facts." "Not to society, they aren't." "Then society can adjust." The Duke's voice was firm. "If Miss Pemberton cares for you, and I suspect she does, then we'll support that. Your mother married me despite significant opposition from her family. Love doesn't bow to convention, Thomas." The dinner was both awkward and wonderful. Catherine looked more beautiful than Thomas remembered, and her eyes lit up when she saw him. They were careful to observe propriety, but their connection was obvious to everyone in the room. After dinner, Lord Pemberton grudgingly granted them 15 minutes alone in the drawing-room, with the door open and a servant nearby. "I've missed you," Catherine said simply. "I've missed you too. Your letters helped keep me sane. Have things improved with your father?" "Remarkably, yes. He's actually trying now. Not always successfully, but he's trying." Thomas hesitated. "Miss Pemberton, Catherine, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Why did you help me? Really, we barely knew each other before all this." She considered the question carefully. "At first, I think I was curious. You'd shown such courage at that tea party, telling the truth when it would have been easier to lie. I wanted to know what kind of person would do that. Then, as I got to know you better, I realized you were someone worth knowing, someone genuine in a world full of pretense. Even though If you say paralyzed one more time as if it defines everything about you, I may have to hit you with my fan." She smiled to soften the words. "Yes, Thomas, you're paralyzed. I have eyes, I can see that. But you're also intelligent, brave, kind, and determined. Those qualities matter more to me than whether you can walk." Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope for a future that included more than just managing an estate alone. "Would you, that is, with your father's permission, would you consider continuing our correspondence? Perhaps visiting occasionally?" I'd like that very much. It wasn't a courtship, not officially, but it was the beginning of something that might become one, given time and patience. A year passed. Thomas turned 18 in October, marking 2 full years since the accident that had changed everything. He'd grown into his role as the Duke's heir, earning respect from tenants and estate workers through fair dealing and genuine interest in their welfare. His education continued, and he'd begun publishing occasional essays in London journals under a pseudonym, analysing economic policy and social issues. His relationship with Catherine had developed slowly, carefully, with both families' cautious approval. She visited Ashworth Manor regularly, and they'd developed a genuine friendship that had deepened into something more. They spoke of marriage, though both knew it would have to wait until Thomas was older and more established in his role. The Duke had changed too. He no longer tried to hide Thomas's condition or make excuses for it. When local nobility visited, Thomas participated fully in discussions, seated in his wheeled chair without apology. Some guests were uncomfortable at first, but most came to respect the young man's intelligence and capability. In November, Thomas made a decision that had been forming for months. "Father, I'd like to visit Mrs. Price." The Duke looked up from his correspondence. "The cleaning woman?" "Yes, it's been over a year since I last saw her. I'd like to check on her welfare and thank her properly for everything she did." The Duke was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I'll arrange a carriage. Would you like me to come with you?" Thomas was surprised. "You'd do that? I owe that woman an apology as well. I dismissed her cruelly, accused her of taking advantage of you when she was doing the opposite. It's time I acknowledged that." They made the journey on a cold November afternoon, this time with the Duke's full knowledge and blessing. Catherine came too, with her father's permission, making it a proper social call rather than a scandalous adventure. When they arrived at Rose Cottage, Mrs. Price answered the door looking older but well. Her eyes widened at the sight of the Duke's carriage, then softened when she saw Thomas. "Master Thomas, Your Grace, Miss Pemberton, this is unexpected." "May we come in, Mrs. Price?" Thomas asked. "We won't take much of your time." She ushered them in, clearly flustered by having such distinguished visitors in her humble cottage. The Duke had to duck to enter, and there was barely room for all of them, plus Thomas's chair. "Mrs. Price," the Duke began formally, "I've come to apologize. I treated you abominably. You helped my son when he desperately needed help, and I repaid your kindness with dismissal and accusations. I was wrong." Mrs. Price stood speechless for a moment. "Your Grace, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll accept my apology, and accept this." He handed her an envelope. "It's not payment for services rendered. Consider it a pension, acknowledgement of the debt our family owes you." Mrs. Price opened the envelope and gasped at the bank draft inside. "Your Grace, this is too much. It's not enough, but it should ensure your comfort for the rest of your life." He glanced at Thomas. "My son has shown me that kindness and station are not related. You have more nobility in your character than most titled lords I know." Mrs. Price's eyes filled with tears. She looked at Thomas. "You've grown, sir. Not just older, but stronger. I can see it in your eyes. Because of what you taught me. To keep moving forward. To find meaning despite suffering. You saved my life, Mrs. Price." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "You saved your own life, sir. I just pointed you in the right direction." They stayed for tea, crowded around her small table. The Duke looked distinctly uncomfortable in such humble surroundings, but he remained gracious. Catherine and Mrs. Price chatted easily about household matters. Thomas simply watched, feeling a deep sense of peace. Before they left, Mrs. Price pulled Thomas aside. "You're happy now, aren't you, sir?" "Yes, or at least I'm learning to be. It's still hard sometimes, but I have people who support me, including you. You don't need me anymore, sir. You found your way. That doesn't mean I stop being grateful or caring about what happens to you." He gestured to the envelope she'd set on her table. "Please accept Father's gift. You've earned it and more." "I will, and I'll pray for you every day, as I have been." She squeezed his hand. "Live well, Master Thomas. Live fully. Don't let your chair define you." "I won't. I promise." As they rode back to Ashworth Manor, the Duke spoke thoughtfully. "That woman has more wisdom than most of my educated colleagues. I've been telling you that for a year, Father." "Yes, well, I'm a slow learner. Unlike my son, who seems to have learned quite a lot from her." Thomas smiled. "She taught me the most important lesson, That a meaningful life isn't about what you can do physically, but about how you treat people and what you choose to value. Catherine took his hand. That's a lesson many able-bodied people never learn. That evening, back at the manor, Thomas sat at his desk and wrote in his journal, something he'd begun doing regularly. He described the visit to Mrs. Price, his father's apology, the sense of things coming full circle. Then he wrote something he'd been thinking about for weeks. 2 years ago, I thought my life had ended. In some ways, it had. The life I'd planned, the future I'd imagined. But in its place, something else has grown. A different life, yes, but not necessarily a lesser one. I've learned that suffering can either destroy you or refine you. The choice is yours. I've learned that kindness can come from unexpected sources, and that accepting help isn't weakness but wisdom. I've learned that my father's love, however imperfectly expressed, was always there. I've learned that a woman like Catherine can look past a wheeled chair and see the man inside. Most importantly, I've learned that I am not my paralysis. I am not defined by what I cannot do, but by what I choose to do with what remains. My legs don't work, but my mind does. My body is limited, but my capacity for love, for learning, for contribution, these have no limits except those I impose on myself. Mrs. Price told me to keep moving forward. I'm still doing that, one day at a time. Some days are harder than others. Some days I rage against the unfairness of it all, but most days now I simply live, I work, I learn, I love, I plan for a future that once seemed impossible. The Duke's son was paralyzed, yes, but he learned to stand in ways that have nothing to do with legs. He set down his pen and looked out the window at the estate grounds, now covered in the first snow of winter. Somewhere out there, Mrs. Price sat in her warm cottage, secure in her comfort for the first time in years. Catherine was in her own home, writing him another letter he'd receive tomorrow. His father was in his study, probably reviewing the accounts Thomas had prepared that afternoon. And Thomas himself sat in his wheeled chair, no longer a prison but simply a tool. One part of who he was, but not the whole. The old woman had touched his legs that first day, not with magic, but with simple human kindness. She hadn't made him walk again, but she'd done something more important. She'd reminded him that he could still stand tall, even sitting down. That was the real miracle. Not a cure, but hope. Not walking, but moving forward despite everything. And that, Thomas had learned, was enough.